The last thing my father ever said to me was spoken so quietly I had to lean in close enough to smell the antiseptic on his skin. 3 days later, he was gone. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 32 years old. I work in construction management out of Nashville, Tennessee, and until 8 months ago, I believed the two most important people in my life after my father were my older brother and his wife. I believed we were a family that bent but never broke. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. My father passed on a Tuesday morning in late October. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate and doesn't give you much runway. We had known for about 4 months, which sounds like enough time to prepare, but it never is. He was 61 years old, sharp-minded until nearly the end, and the kind of man who wore his dignity like a second skin. He never complained. Not once. Even when the pain was bad enough to see it move across his face, he would just press his lips together and redirect the conversation. The morning of his funeral, I wore the only suit I owned. It was a gray one he had helped me pick out 3 years earlier for a job interview. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror before leaving the house, thinking he would have had something to say about the collar. He always had something to say about collars. The service was small. Dad didn't have many friends left. He was the kind of man who outlived his closest ones. There was my brother, his wife, a few neighbors from the old house on Clover Street, and my father's longtime accountant, Mr. Briggs, who sat in the back row with his hands folded and his eyes red in a way he clearly hadn't planned for. I held it together through most of it. I didn't cry until the drive back, alone in my truck, somewhere on I-65 with the radio off and the Nashville skyline fading in my rearview mirror. I let it out there, where no one could see it. That's what my father had taught me, not that men don't grieve, but that grief is private. It belongs to you. When I got back to my father's house, the house where we had both grown up, my brother and his wife were already there. They had a key. That had always been fine before, but something about arriving and seeing their car already in the driveway made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I almost went straight inside. Instead, I stopped on the front porch to check my phone. My father's attorney had sent an email asking me to come by the office that week for a reading of the will. I already knew the basics. The house on Clover Street, split between me and my brother. My father had mentioned that much. I typed a reply confirming Thursday at 10, then reached for the door. That's when I heard my brother's voice through the open window. He wasn't shouting. He was laughing. That particular laugh he only had when he was comfortable, when he thought no one outside the room could hear him. And the words beneath it, once my brain caught up to them, made my hand freeze on the doorknob. He's going to hand it over without even blinking, my brother said. He trusts me. He's always trusted me. That's his whole problem. His wife said something I couldn't fully catch. Then my brother again. The storage business is the one worth taking. Dad built that thing up for 15 years. Ethan doesn't even know what it's worth. He's never paid attention to the financials. Another pause. Her voice, lower. And he'll just sign? I'll tell him it makes sense for tax reasons. He doesn't know anything about estate law. I'll have Marcus draw up paperwork that looks official. Ethan will read the summary, not the fine print. He always does. I stood there on the porch for a long moment. The smell of fallen leaves was sharp and damp around me. My father had been in the ground for less than 6 hours. Inside the house he had built from nothing. My brother was already dividing it up. I didn't open the door. I stepped back, walked quietly to my truck, and sat in the driver's seat with both hands in my lap. My mind went still the way it does sometimes on a job site when something has gone structurally wrong, a controlled stillness, the kind that has to come before you can think clearly. I drove to a diner on Gallatin Pike, where my father used to take us on Sunday mornings when we were kids. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and sat in a corner booth trying to understand the shape of what I had just heard. Not the shock of it, I was past shock within the first few minutes. What I was trying to understand was how long. How long had my brother seen me this way? As the one who doesn't read the fine print. As the problem that was easy to solve. Thursday morning, I went to the attorney's office alone. My brother had texted asking to come with me. I told him the attorney had requested individual appointments for each beneficiary. That wasn't true, but he believed it. He always assumed I was too straightforward to lie. The attorney's name was Patricia Holt. She was a small woman in her 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a posture that suggested she had sat through many of these meetings and understood exactly what they cost people. She was direct with me, which I appreciated. She told me my father had updated his will 6 weeks before he died. My father had owned a self-storage and moving company, Cole Storage Solutions, that he had built over 15 years from a single rented lot into a business with 3 locations in Middle Tennessee. I had helped him pour the foundation of the first building when I was 19 years old. I remembered the concrete mixing in the August heat and my father handing me a water bottle without saying anything, which was his version of taking care of you. According to the updated will, the business, all 3 locations, the equipment, the contracts, the accounts receivable was left entirely to me. The house on Clover Street went to my brother. Patricia also handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. I recognized it, immediately the same blocky print he used to leave notes on the refrigerator when we were growing up. There was also a second item. A savings account I had never known existed, held in a small regional bank in Cookeville, about 80 miles east. The balance, as of the last statement, was $412,000. I sat with that information for a moment. Patricia watched me with the particular patience of someone who knows that some numbers take time to land. My father had never spoken about this account. Not once. He lived modestly, drove the same truck for 11 years, bought clothes at a discount, clipped grocery coupons into his 70s. But he had been quietly setting aside money for decades in an account no one knew about. An account left entirely to me. I asked Patricia if my brother had been notified of the will's contents. She said the letter had gone out the previous day, as per standard process. I thanked her, put the envelope in my inside coat pocket, and drove back to Nashville. I didn't open the envelope until I was home, sitting at my kitchen table with the lights on and the rest of the house quiet. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten. I'll keep most of it private, it was written for me, and that's how it should stay. But I'll share one part, because it's the part that told me everything I needed to know about what my father had understood and what he had planned. He wrote, "I know your brother. I have always known him. And I know you. I changed the will because the business needs someone who respects what it took to build it. The account is yours because you never once asked me for anything, and I want you to have something that no argument can reach. Don't let guilt make you smaller than you are." I read that twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. The next morning, I called my father's accountant, Mr. Briggs, who had cried quietly at the back of the funeral. He had worked with my father for over 20 years and knew the business inside out. I asked him to meet me for breakfast. Over eggs and coffee at a place near his office, I told him what I'd heard on the porch. I told him what Patricia Holt had told me. I asked him to be straight with me about the business's value. He looked at me over his coffee cup for a moment before answering. Coal Storage Solutions, he said, was currently worth somewhere between $1.2 and $1.6 million, depending on the market and the terms of a sale. The third location, which my father had built out just 2 years ago, had strong occupancy and was in a corridor where commercial real estate was appreciating quickly. I put my fork down. Mr. Briggs said my father had always intended the business to go to me. He had told him that more than a year before updating the will. He said my father had not told my brother because he had seen, over the years, the way my brother related to the business as an asset to be liquidated, not a thing to be run. I asked Mr. Briggs if he would be willing to stay on as accountant through a transition. He said he wouldn't have it any other way. That afternoon, my brother called. His voice had an easiness to it that I now understood was performed. It was the voice he used when he needed something from me. "So, you've talked to the attorney?" he said. I told him I had. "Dad's will was a little uneven," he said. "I think he wasn't thinking as clearly at the end. You and I both know that." I said I thought Dad had been thinking clearly. There was a pause. "I've already talked to Marcus about the business situation. From a legal and tax standpoint, it would make a lot more sense to consolidate." I told him I wasn't interested in consolidating. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, the easiness was gone. "Ethan, the house needs work. What Dad left me isn't close to what he left you. You know that's not fair." I told him I thought Dad had been pretty clear about what was fair. He didn't respond right away. "Then, we should talk in person." I told him I agreed and that I would be in touch. Then I ended the call and sat quietly for a moment before picking up the phone again and calling Patricia Holt's office to ask about formally registering the business transfer with the state and whether there were any steps I needed to take immediately to protect the assets. She told me she would start the paperwork that afternoon. My brother showed up at my apartment 2 days later, unannounced. I saw his car in the lot from my window and took a breath before going downstairs. He was wearing the jacket he wore when he wanted to look serious, dark navy, the one he saved for bank meetings. His wife was with him. She stood slightly behind him with her arms crossed and an expression she probably thought was neutral. I stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind me. My brother started calmly. He talked about fairness, about family, about how Dad's judgment had been compromised by illness. He talked about how the house on Clover Street needed a new roof and new HVAC and how that wasn't a gift, it was a burden. He talked about how it would be right, how Dad would have wanted for us to find an arrangement that made sense for both of us. I let him finish. Then I said, I heard you on the porch the day of the funeral. His face didn't move for a moment. His wife looked at the ground. I said, I heard everything. The storage business. The tax paperwork. Marcus. All of it. He started to say something. I think it was going to be a denial, or a reframe, some version of you misunderstood. I had watched him do that my whole life. Find the angle that made the thing you clearly saw become the thing you had imagined. I didn't let him get there. I told him Dad had updated the will because he knew. Not because he was sick or confused or persuaded by anyone. Because he was a man who paid attention, and he had paid attention to both of us for 32 years, and he had made a decision based on that. My brother looked at me, and for a moment I saw something cross his face that I hadn't seen there before. Not anger. Something quieter. Something that might have been recognition. Then his wife said, You're going to throw away your family over money? I looked at her. He was going to take what our father built over 15 years and have me sign it away in paperwork I wouldn't read. That's not family. That's an arrangement. She didn't have an answer for that. My brother said, So that's it, you're just done with us. I told him I wasn't done with him. I told him I had grown up with him and loved him and that none of that had changed overnight. But I was not going to sign anything, and I was not going to pretend the conversation on the porch hadn't happened, and I was not going to let guilt or pressure move me away from what my father had decided and why. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the car. His wife followed without saying anything else. I went back upstairs and stood in my kitchen for a while with my hand on the counter. Just breathing. The following weeks were not clean or simple. My brother called twice more. The calls were shorter each time and colder. His wife sent one text, something about how I had always been selfish, how our father had enabled it, how one day I would understand what I had thrown away. I read it once, then put the phone face down. What nobody tells you about standing your ground is that it doesn't feel triumphant. It just feels like work. Every day, another decision, another document, another conversation with Patricia or Mr. Briggs or the site managers at the 3 storage locations. I had spent years building other people's structures, and now I was learning to build something of my own, and the learning curve was steeper than I had expected. But the site managers were good people. I visited all 3 locations within the first 2 weeks, introduced myself to every employee, walked every building. At the Murfreesboro location, a woman named Diane had been managing day-to-day operations for 6 years. She had known my father well. When I introduced myself, she said, He talked about you all the time. Said you had good instincts but that you needed a reason to use them. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Mr. Briggs walked me through the financials over 4 sessions, patient and methodical. The business was healthy. Not extravagant but solid in the way my father had been solid, built on relationships and consistency rather than flash. There were some inefficiencies we identified, some contracts that needed renegotiating, but nothing that wasn't fixable with attention and time. I moved the savings from the Cookville account into a separate account I opened in my own name. I kept it separate from the business accounts deliberately. It was money my father had set aside with intention, and I wanted to use it the same way. I spent a lot of evenings at his house on Clover Street in those first months. My brother hadn't done anything with it yet. I still had a key from years ago, and I would let myself in sometimes and sit in the kitchen the way I had when I was a kid, when the house smelled like coffee and sawdust and whatever my father had been working on in the garage. One evening, I found a box in the back of his closet that I hadn't seen before. Inside were photographs, mostly of the storage lot in the early years, when it was just chain link fence and gravel and one half-built structure. There were photos of me at 19, shirtless in the August heat, standing next to a concrete mixer looking like I had no idea what I was doing. Which was true. There was a photo of my father standing in front of the finished first building, arms crossed, not quite smiling but something close to it. Underneath the photographs was a note in his handwriting, undated. It said, The thing you build with your hands is yours forever, even after it's sold. Nobody can take the building of it. I stayed in that closet for a while. It was around month 4 when I made the decision about the Cookville account. I had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over from different angles. My father had left it for me without conditions. I could have kept all of it. No one would have said anything. But I kept coming back to something, to the employees at the 3 locations, the ones who had showed up every day for years and kept the thing running, and to a conversation I'd had with Diane at the Murfreesboro location. She had mentioned, offhandedly, that one of her part-time guys had been working 2 jobs since his wife got sick, and that healthcare costs had wiped out most of what they'd saved. I talked to Mr. Briggs about setting up a small emergency fund for employees, not a loan program, a fund. Money employees could access in genuine hardship situations without applications or credit checks or any of the machinery that turns help into humiliation. Mr. Briggs said my father would have liked that. We seeded it with $80,000 from the Cookville account. I used another portion to repair the roof on the Clover Street house before winter. I didn't tell my brother I had done it. I hired a crew, had it done in 2 days, and locked the door when they left. If he sold the house, it would sell better. If he kept it, the rain wouldn't get in. Either way, it was the right thing. I have not spoken to my brother since the afternoon on the parking lot outside my apartment. His wife blocked me on everything, which was its own kind of answer. I don't know what he thought would happen, maybe that I would eventually fold, that guilt would do what pressure hadn't. Or maybe he just needed someone to be angry at, and I was the available option. What I know is this: my father was not confused in his final weeks. He was not moved by sentiment or impaired judgment. He was a man who spent 61 years watching people carefully and quietly, who built a business with his hands and his reputation, and who made one final decision with perfect clarity. He gave me the thing that could be taken. He gave my brother the thing that couldn't. The house is solid. It was built well. Even with a new roof and everything it needs, it will stand for another 50 years. That is not a burden. That is what my father was, in physical form, something that takes work but lasts. I have been running the business for 7 months now. I am not my father. I am louder, more impatient, worse with small talk, but I am learning the shape of what he built and I am trying to be worthy of it. Some days that's easier than others. Last week, Diane called me from Murfreesboro to tell me that the part-time employee, the one whose wife had been sick, had used the emergency fund and was able to cut down to 1 job for the first time in over a year. She said he had asked her to tell the owner thank you, that he had been skeptical at first because he'd never seen a company do something like that without strings attached. I told her to tell him it was no strings. That's the whole point. I still drive out to the first location sometimes, the original one, the one my father built from gravel and chain link. I park in the same spot he used to park in. I figured that out from the photographs, and I look at the building and I think about him standing in the August heat watching me pour concrete at 19 years old. Not quite smiling, but something close to it. I kept my promise too. Just a different one than I expected to be keeping. A few weeks ago, I was going through the last of his things at the Clover Street house. My brother had finally moved forward with selling it and had sent someone to begin clearing the personal effects. I went over to make sure nothing important was left behind. In the garage, tucked behind a shelf of paint cans and extension cords, I found something I hadn't seen in years: a photograph of the two of us as kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, sitting on the tailgate of our father's old truck. We were both squinting into the sun. My brother had his arm around my shoulder and was grinning like he had just gotten away with something. I looked like I was trying to figure out what. I stood there holding it for a moment. Then I set it on the shelf where the new owners would find it or not find it, and I walked out to my truck and I drove home. Some things you carry. Some things you set down. Knowing the difference, that's what my father was trying to tell me. Not just with the will, with everything. With every water bottle passed without words, every note left on a refrigerator, every photograph kept in a box at the back of a closet. He had spent his whole life showing me, and I had spent mine learning to see it. I think I'm starting to.